Welcome back, guys, to Dark Night Scare. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 true disturbing stories about the Appalachian Mountains. If you thought the mountains were peaceful, you might think again. But before we begin, please consider subscribing and don't forget to like and share it with your friends. Let me know where you're watching from. Thank you all. Now let's start. I'm a freelance web designer, which primarily means I spend too much time staring at a screen and answering emails at odd hours. This situation also allowed me to vanish when things became especially dire without anyone noticing. After everything crumbled, I acquired a small cabin. My divorce had finalized. My lease in Pittsburgh had ended. In all honesty, no one reached out anymore. Not since Emma passed away 2 years earlier. I still kept her shampoo in the shower, holding on to the hope that she might return. I mentioned to my friends that I was heading to the mountains to clear my mind and possibly write something. They didn't pry too much. I believe they were simply relieved to hear from me. The place I bought was quite inexpensive. A rundown cabin a few miles outside a tiny town known as Briar Hollow. It bordered the Monongahela forest, but the final stretch of road was largely gravel mixed with hope. There was no signal, no power, and no plumbing. It was precisely the kind of isolation I thought I needed. Quiet, secluded, devoid of any reminders of people or events. The individual who sold it to me didn't engage in small talk. He simply handed over the keys and warned, "If you hear anything at night, don't go looking. Not everything walks on 2 feet." With that, he drove off before I could conjure a response. Initially, everything was fine. Strange, but fine. The nights were dark. There were no streetlights, nor the distant hum of traffic. Just insects buzzing, trees swaying, and the old cabin creaking as it settled. I had never experienced silence like that before. It wasn't peaceful. It felt dense. On the third night, however, it began. Around 2 a.m., I roused to a sound, not loud, but distinct. A rhythmic tapping pattern. I approached the back window, and there it was. A staircase of stone, inexplicably positioned in the woods about 30 yards from the cabin. I knew for certain it hadn't existed before. I had walked that patch earlier that day while gathering firewood. It ascended straight up, maybe 15 or 20 steps. I stood there staring until dawn began to break. In the morning, I ventured to investigate it. It was genuinely there, cold against my skin. No moss, no dirt, no explanation for its presence. I circled around it twice but didn't climb it. Something about it just seemed off. Yet I chose to remain. That night, sleep eluded me. I was plagued by a low vibration, akin to a subwoofer humming beneath the floorboards. No audible sound, just pressure. My ears wouldn't pop, and I noticed my nose was bleeding, a phenomenon that had never happened before. The following day, the staircase had edged closer, though not dramatically, maybe just about 10 feet, enough to reassure me that I wasn't losing touch with reality. I attempted to start my truck, but it wouldn't even make a sound. The battery was functional, the lights worked, but the engine refused to attempt ignition. Frustrated, I decided to hike. I packed a backpack, flashlight, and compass, setting out for a straight 2-hour trek. When I paused to check my direction, I found myself standing again by the back porch of the cabin. The trees appeared different, closer than before. That night, I bartered up the windows. By midnight, I heard steps again, slow, firm, and deliberate, descending the staircase. I didn't dare look. I merely lay there completely still, listening. The sound halted just at the edge of the porch, remaining there for what felt like ages before retreating. The following day, the staircase had moved onto the porch, directly touching it. That night, I finally saw her. She wasn't Emma, not at all. A tall, unnaturally elongated figure with sagging grey skin. It looked as though she had been pulled from water, her head tilted grotesquely to one side, as though her neck had snapped but hadn't acknowledged it. Her mouth hung open, as if something had forced it apart. The most disturbing aspect was the sound. That same humming, now amplified, emanating from her chest, rather than her mouth. She stood at the top of the stairs, watching me, before vanishing. Sleep evaded me. I couldn't eat either. I started to hallucinate. Maybe. One night, I awoke standing on the porch. Another time, I found myself partway up the stairs with no memory of how I had gotten there. My feet were scraped and bleeding, my hands filthy. Each night, the footsteps came, stopping just short of crossing the threshold. By the 10th night, I had reached my breaking point. I gathered whatever I could carry and fled. I didn't care where, only that I needed to escape. I made it about a mile before collapsing. I believe I lost consciousness. Upon waking, the staircase was still visible through the trees, but I was sufficient distance away that I couldn't hear the humming anymore. Eventually, I wandered onto an old ranger trail. They found me the following day, dehydrated and in poor condition. One ranger, a woman named Andrea, didn't blink when I recounted my experience. She simply replied, "People go missing out here. You didn't. That's significant. I never returned. I sold the cabin at a loss. It didn't matter. Now, I reside in Harrisburg, still designing websites and still sleeping with the lights on." About 3 years back, I had a seasonal post assigned to me, tracking blackberry activity in the Appalachian Mountains near the Virginia-Tennessee border. The contract extended from spring to fall, requiring me to live alone in a secluded section of the forest. The cabin was roughly 30 miles from the nearest paved road. They transported me and my gear in a lifted truck, navigating the tough terrain. The cabin itself was a prefab structure, metal walls, a thin roof, the entire space just one room, containing a cot, a generator, and a propane heater. There was no cell phone service or Wi-Fi, just a shortwave radio for emergencies and check-ins on Sundays. My tasks included setting up trail cameras, monitoring GPS collars, and recording wildlife movements. I was aware of the solitude of the job, and during the first few weeks, I busied myself hiking, tagging, and examining the cameras. I encountered occasional bear or coyote tracks, an abundance of deer, and a few old hunting stands. There were no issues, but the most unsettling factor was the intense silence. No traffic, no voices, strictly the sounds of birds and the wind rustling through trees. One night around 2 a.m., I heard what I thought was a deer circling around the cabin. The footsteps were light, slow, and inconsistent, so I remained in bed, expecting it to pass by. Suddenly, there was a dragging noise, something long and heavy being pulled across the ground, scraping against dirt and stone until it stopped just outside my window. I lay still, listening. No knocks or voices, only dragging. It persisted for about 10 minutes before halting. The following morning, I examined the surroundings of the cabin but found no tracks. The hard-packed dirt weren't ideal for footprints, yet I expected some signs of activity. I theorized it must have been an animal, perhaps a bear that was injured or carrying its prey. I documented the occurrence in my log and continued with my tasks. However, the dragging sound returned over the subsequent nights, always staying just out of my sight and never close enough to see what was causing it. I began having difficulty sleeping through the nights. In the 3rd week, I went to check one of the trail cameras and it was missing. Not damaged, just gone. The metal mount was still attached to the tree, but the camera had been neatly taken down. There were no claw marks, no teeth marks, nothing. Almost as if someone had unscrewed it and walked away with it. I suspected poachers and reported the incident over the shortwave radio, but received no response, not even static. The radio was entirely dead. I checked the wiring, batteries, and antenna, and everything appeared normal. It had functioned properly the night before, but now it was silent. I resolved to leave at sunrise and report everything in town. At dawn, I packed my gear and attempted to start the truck, but it wouldn't turn over. The battery light flickered briefly, then faded. There were no clicks, no sputters, nothing. I opened the hood, and everything looked fine. No loose wires, no visible damage. Then I crouched to peer beneath it and saw it. 4 deep gouges across the gas tank, long, clean, and curved. They didn't match the marks of any animal I could identify. Running my fingers over the metal, I realized it had been peeled back as if claws had scraped through it. Near the rear tires, I noticed dirt prints resembling human footprints, but elongated. Each foot almost twice the length of mine. The gait was peculiar, one foot landing flat while the other dragged behind, indicating a limp. The prints led back into the woods. I scampered back inside, locking the door, and spent the day checking windows while listening intently. That night, there was no dragging sound or footsteps, just silence until 3:17 a.m. Breathing was close, heavy and wet, right outside my front door. Then came a knock, 4 soft, gentle taps. I sat motionless in the dark, gripping my wrench while staring at the door until the first light of dawn filtered through the window. When I opened the door in daylight, no one was there. No tracks. But on the porch, there lay a single dead bird, its neck twisted with both eyes missing. I packed my bag, laced up my boots, and set off. I wouldn't wait for help. The ranger station was 15 miles east, and I was familiar with the trail. For 4 hours, I hiked without pausing, turning at every sound. Around mile 8, the dragging sound returned, again behind me in the trees. I didn't run, just quickened my pace, careful to avoid tripping while maintaining forward momentum. Then I noticed it, crouched behind a tree about 20 yards back. Its skin appeared ash-colored, with long black hair masking most of its face. It didn't stand, instead crawling in a crooked manner, arms leading while its legs trailed behind, seemingly broken. I glimpsed the curve of its spine beneath the skin, a multitude of vertebrae. Its shoulders jutted unnaturally high as it lifted its head, revealing a grin filled with long, jagged teeth, too many to fit easily in a human mouth. Suddenly, it tapped against the tree, 4 times, slow and steady. That was when I bolted, not stopping for water, barely looking back. I ran until my legs gave out a half-mile from the station, crawling the last 100 feet. When the ranger found me, I could hardly speak. He brought me inside and handed me water. I told him my truck had broken down, omitting anything regarding the creature. I needed to confirm if it had left anything behind. We drove back to the cabin in his truck. My vehicle started without problem. The gouges had vanished, and the radio worked perfectly. All the gear I had previously left inside remained untouched, but the bird was still on the porch. The ranger assumed it had been a fox or bobcat and suggested I take a few days off to clear my head. I didn't argue. I left that afternoon and rented a hotel room in town. I never returned to the cabin, and the following year, I transferred to a position out west. Desert wildlife, expansive spaces devoid of trees, clear skies, no shadows. I haven't told the agency what truly happened. They wouldn't believe me. I work for private companies, timber corporations, mineral rights firms, occasionally developers looking to build on pristine land. It's not an office job. My work takes place deep in the wilderness, often in locations that haven't seen human feet in decades, sometimes longer. I hike in, camp out and map everything. Terrain slopes, water flow, soil composition, elevations, rock formations. I essentially assist companies in figuring out how to utilize land they haven't even surveyed yet. Honestly, I enjoy it that way. Being out where there's no one else, all alone, focused, with no distractions. The silence can creep into your head, but I've always found comfort in that. This past summer, I received a job from a timber company wanting to tap into a new section along the Kentucky-Tennessee border, deep within the Appalachian range. The area was remote, with no real roads, no cell signal, and no towns for miles. They had sectioned it off, and I was assigned one of the larger quadrants. I was told to spend at least 3 days on site, accessible by foot only. This didn't bother me. I've been on longer trips and have even been dropped by helicopter and told to find my own way out. So I agreed, packed my gear, and prepared for the journey. However, I felt a strange tension from the start. This job fell off, not dramatically so, just that unease in my gut, as if the land itself didn't want to be catalogued. I loaded my pack with essentials: satellite GPS, a solar panel charger, 2 radios, an emergency beacon, laminated topographic maps, a compass, food, water, a small stove, a fire starting kit, my tent, a sidearm, and extra batteries. Light but efficient. Always pack as if your ride might not return. My drop-off point led me to an overgrown logging path off a dirt road that looked like no one had driven it since the 90s. The man who dropped me off was quiet and didn't make small talk. As I climbed out, he glanced at the tree line, then back at me and simply said, "See you on Friday. Try not to wander too far." Those words only heightened the anxiety in my stomach. I watched the truck drive away, its taillights vanishing in the dust before I turned to the trees and began hiking. I set up camp by a small stream within the first 2 miles. The woods were dense but manageable, nothing I hadn't coped with before. I boiled water, cooked some instant rice, and checked my coordinates. Everything seemed routine until around 11. I had just zipped up my tent and was jotting notes in my log when I heard movement on the far side, slow and heavy, like someone methodically walking through the dry leaves. It didn't sound light enough to be a deer, nor did it have the erratic motion of a raccoon or the quick thudding of a bear. Whatever it was moved without concern for whether I heard it. I sat completely still, reached for my flashlight without turning it on, just holding it while I listened. It passed maybe 10 or 15 feet away without breaking into a run, just moving steadily along. After it left, I spent another hour listening to the silence. Come dawn, I checked around my site. No tracks, no bent grass, not even a scuff in the dirt. On the second day, I started early, working steadily north through steep ridgelines. The landscape was beautiful in its raw, forgotten way. Deep valleys, thick canopies, ancient rock outcroppings. My GPS faltered in the denser parts, but nothing significant. Around 3:00 p.m., I came across something peculiar, not marked on any of the maps. It was a circular stone structure, roughly 4 feet high, spiral-shaped, as if someone had painstakingly stacked fist-sized rocks in a perfect coil. This wasn't a cairn. Cairns appear different. This was too symmetrical, too intentional. I stood admiring it for a while, walking around it twice, taking photos and logging the coordinates before moving on. Still, I admit it captivated my attention, and I glanced back at it often. On that night, I didn't make camp until it was nearly dark. I'd pushed too far in my effort to cover more ground. As I walked, I began noticing something off. Whenever I came to a stop, I could hear something else stop in response, always to my right, always far enough away that I could never see it. It didn't feel like an animal. I called out loudly, "Hello, is anyone there?" Silence answered me back. I camped in a shallow ditch without building a fire, unpacking only the essentials. I sat up with my pistol across my lap, eyes fixed on the trees. Sleep eluded me. By the third day, I was eager to leave. I figured if I moved quickly, I could finish the last section and get closer to the ranger station marked on my backup map. I decided to cut through a ravine, a mistake, as the place hadn't seen human feet in decades. Overgrown, slick rocks, thick vines. About halfway through, I encountered something that froze me in place. A tree split perfectly down the middle, like someone had wielded a hatchet. Inside the split, both sides were carved with symbols, not words or images, just shapes deeply etched with sharp lines. Some looked geometric, while others were abstract. I did not document or photograph them. Instead, I just stepped backward out of the ravine and took a mile-long detour. That afternoon, I crossed over a ridge, expecting open land. Instead, I stumbled upon something more macabre than the spiral stones. Dozens of bones, small ones, perhaps birds, squirrels, maybe a fox or two. They were arranged in a long pattern across the grass, some tied together with string and feathers, others stuck into the ground like stakes. There were no signs of wear, no moss, no leaves. Someone had constructed that recently and kept it clean. I stepped forward once, just once. The trees overhead fell utterly silent. Not a flutter, not a chirp. I retreated and kept walking without stopping. I continued on through the night, aiming for the ranger station by sunrise. Around midnight, the atmosphere shifted. I can't quite explain it, but I felt the change. The air felt thinner, as if I'd climbed to a substantially higher elevation. My chest began to tighten, almost as if I couldn't get enough air. All the common sounds of the forest, crickets, leaves, frogs, vanished, leaving only my boots crunching against the ground and the sound of my own breath. Then I heard it, a scream from behind, far enough away but not out of reach. It began human-like but transformed into something horrifying and metallic as it persisted. It sounded like a person being torn apart, desperately attempting to call for help through a throat filled with broken glass. I took off running. Branches clawed at my arms. My pack thumped hard against my back. I didn't care about my destination, just away. I ran until my legs betrayed me, collapsing near a fallen tree, gasping for breath. I lay there, hardly moving for hours. I didn't hear the scream again, but this time I did hear footsteps growing nearer, accompanied by the sound of breathing. Just as dawn began to light the sky, I managed to find the ranger station. It looked as if it had been swallowed by the forest. Old wood covered in vines, porch nearly obscured, and windows almost blacked out. Yet there was someone sitting on the porch, as if they had been there throughout the night. When the ranger stood upon seeing me, he didn't appear surprised or ask questions. He simply observed me and said, "You made it out late." I recounted everything I saw, the spiral, the tree, the bones. He merely nodded solemnly and said, "We don't map that stretch anymore." That was all he said. The company paid me half the promised sum and didn't pursue the rest of the data. They assigned another tech, Harlan, to complete my quadrant. When I checked the files later, I saw that he hadn't reported back. He never submitted coordinates, nor uploaded a single note, and no one ever found his tent. When I was 18, it all unfolded. I had signed up for a weekend trail restoration project organized by the State Parks Department. They branded it as a Conservation Youth Corps, which sounded a lot cooler than the reality, primarily an excuse to get teenagers to haul brush and dig drainage ditches in exchange for volunteer hours and a line on college applications. 5 of us, all from nearby towns, were involved. I didn't know anyone on the first day, but we got along reasonably well. Nothing dramatic occurred, just the polite, somewhat awkward bonding typical when strangers are thrown together in the woods for work. We were supervised by a ranger named Morgan. In her mid-30s, she was quiet yet competent. The sort of person who maintained her cool even when she probably should have been rattled. It was on the 3rd day that the atmosphere began to shift. We were set to hike an old fire road that had sat closed for decades. Morgan mentioned it had once connected to a ridge with a fire watchtower back in the 1950s, but nature had mostly reclaimed it. The trail wasn't charted on any current maps, making it feel like we were venturing into a forgotten corner of the state. As we walked further, the landscape became increasingly bizarre. The path began to yield to soft moss and low ferns, appearing as though it was being consumed. Eventually, we drifted from walking in a line to pairing up, checking for loose stones, broken boards, anything that could present a hazard to future hikers. It was then that we spotted it. The cabin emerged so abruptly that I genuinely thought I was imagining it at first. It appeared abandoned yet curiously remained intact, not ruined in the way one would expect. The roof sagged inward like a collapsed lung. The wood siding faded to a bleached grey from years of damp air and sunlight. Ivy had overtaken much of one wall, and the porch steps were half buried in the earth. An old metal mailbox sat on the side, tilted awkwardly and rusty in places. Morgan halted, blinking at the cabin as if it had sprung up from nowhere. "That's not supposed to be here," she murmured. Stepping closer, confusion flickered across her face for the first time since we had met. We queried whether it was part of an old station, but she shook her head. "It's not included in any survey logs," she stated. We weren't expecting to return to camp for a couple more hours, so Morgan decided we would take a break there while she trekked back to retrieve a toolkit we had inadvertently left behind at the previous clearing. She claimed she'd be gone no longer than 15 minutes and instructed us not to enter the structure. Barely a minute had passed before June spotted the envelope. She had wandered around to the side of the cabin and beckoned us over. The mailbox remained perplexingly intact, especially given the condition of the cabin. Inside, perfectly dry, was a yellowed envelope sealed with a peculiar thick wax, reminiscent of what one would expect from a drip of a candle that never cooled completely. The name Maris was inscribed on the front in a shakily artistic handwriting, chaotic yet elegant. June handed it to me. I held it, almost involuntarily. It felt lighter than anticipated, as if the paper had hollowed itself out. We hesitated to open it, instead passing it amongst ourselves, trading silly jokes about old moonshine shacks and ghost letters. Yet when I stepped into the cabin, an instant tension gripped me. Instead of the expected odor of decay, which would have made sense, I was met with a metallic scent, hot wires or charred dust inside an old toaster. The floorboards creaked beneath us, but it was not just the audibility. The striking patterns of footprints etched into the dust led across the room and abruptly halted in corners where nothing existed. The dust appeared manipulated, as if shapes had been brushed into it, only to be partially erased. A broken chair sat dead center, facing the wall, seemingly positioned deliberately. In the corner, a sagging cot suggested someone had folded up into it and never uncurled. None of it made sense. At the far end, there was a cast-iron wood stove, encrusted with rust. I opened it to investigate whether anything had been burned inside. Instead, I uncovered another envelope. Same type of wax, same name. Maris. I left it unopened and shoved both into the bottom of my bag, zipping it up without a word. A few minutes later, Morgan returned and we continued onward. That night, after lights out, I sat on the edge of my cot, flashlight clutched under my sleeping bag, and opened the second envelope from the stove. A single sentence was neatly printed in the center of the page. "Don't let it whisper through your words." That was it. No signature, no date, no context. The following morning, I showed it to the group. Laughter erupted easily in the daylight. Someone jested that it resembled the sort of eerie poetry someone might scribble while pursuing crystals at community college. We laughed it off until the discomfort faded. Then we pressed back into our work. As we ventured towards a flagged drainage cut near Slate Ridge, I distinctly remember the first hour. As I was chewing on sunflower seeds and attempting to sync my steps with my breath to stave off overheating, then I noticed the tree, a gnarled oak, its roots pulling sideways in a tightly coiled manner. I had marked it the previous day with a red flag. Suddenly, we discovered ourselves entirely out of where we were meant to be. Morgan looked bewildered. Pulling out her compass, she scrutinized it closely. The needle spun erratically, seemingly searching for a signal, before finally settling and pointing due south, entirely the wrong direction. We all fell quiet. Then the cabin re-emerged from the underbrush, same clearing, sagging porch, and crooked mailbox. Without speaking, Morgan instructed us to take a break. I drifted away from the group, retreating toward the tree line, hoping to make sense of how we had circled back unknowingly. At that moment I heard it. "Hey, I'm over here." It was my voice. Same tone, same pacing, yet not close enough to reach me. I froze, not answering, merely listening. It came from behind the cabin. Panicking, I dashed back to the group, my heart racing. June was staring behind me. "You were just there!" she exclaimed, waving. "No!" I gasped, already breathless. "I was by the trees," she frowned. "Your shirt?" It was red. Mine was green, faded with sweat. There's no mistaking it. Neither of us uttered much beyond that. I pulled Morgan aside to recount everything. She didn't laugh or seem surprised. She simply checked the radio batteries. We attempted to depart once again, selecting a different trail, moving quickly, and focusing intently. Yet every twist in the path only resulted in us heading back like we were stuck in a loop. Suddenly, the cabin door slammed shut behind us with no one touching it. We collectively turned, observing it creak open just a tad. Morgan raised her radio, and static erupted, harsh and raw. Suddenly, my voice echoed through it. "Maris, it's okay. Come inside." She dropped the radio, and silence enveloped us. With no words spoken, we departed, moving without conversation while Morgan instinctively led the way. I could see her jaw clenched, capturing my focus as her hand gripped and released the strap of her bag. Then we spotted it, the rapid footsteps behind us mimicking our pace, followed by a raspy version of my voice, gritty and fragmented. "Wait, please." I exchanged glances with June. She mouthed, "Don't look back." And so, I didn't. None of us did, though we could hear it navigate through the trees above us. At one point, it overshadowed us amongst the branches. Then a second, deeper voice joined in, slow and steady. "You already did. You already let me." My mind flickered back to the envelope I hadn't opened, tightly zipped in my bag. Without thought, I hurled it all off the trail, kicking it into the underbrush, and we didn't stop. 20 minutes had passed when the trees opened before us, allowing us to step onto gravel. Real gravel. The ranger station greeted us, and Morgan's truck stood there as if it had never left. We climbed in. Not one of us glanced back. Later that night, resting at home, I unzipped my coat pocket, only to discover that second envelope. I hadn't grabbed it, yet there it was. I burned it in the kitchen sink, but it wouldn't catch fire. Instead, it only emitted smoke for 20 minutes before the corner finally curled up. I work in land surveying. Not glamorous work, but it pays the bills. Lots of walking and paperwork, and sometimes when my job takes me to areas such as Carrick Hollow Mountain in Tennessee, the silence can be more than I ever wished for. That unsettling silence can turn on you quickly. Back in 2009, I received an assignment near the northern slope of the mountain. An old mining company wanted environmental assessments on some abandoned shafts, a job that typically requires minimal questioning. Just take your measurements, submit your reports, and leave. I was teamed with two others, Kyle, who never ceased to make jokes, and Reggie, who spoke as if saving words for urgent situations. For 3 days, we mapped entrances, recorded soil conditions, gauged air quality, and encountered no cell signal, utilizing only radios and a satellite GPS unit that only worked if you held it at just the right angle and whispered sweet nothings. On the 4th day, we stumbled upon something strange. No flags, no records. It was Reggie who noticed the ground sagging under a layer of rotten leaves not far from a collapsed hunting blind. He cleared some debris and observed, "This wasn't on the layout." Kyle, ever helpful, leaned in and said, "Looks like Hell's mailbox." He tossed a rock into the shaft, and we waited. Silence. That should have been our cue to mark it off, jot a note and report it, but I dislike leaving jobs unfinished. Foolish, I know, but I didn't want to hike back out just to file a maybe report. So I descended. I clipped my helmet light on and began to lower myself. The shaft was narrower than others we had seen, tight enough to force me to suck in my gut. The old wooden rungs bolted to stone creaked, but held until one didn't. I was roughly 30 or 35 feet down when a rung gave way under my foot. I dropped rapidly, crashing onto a sloped floor made of gravel and old metal beams. Pain shot through my ribs as something jabbed into me. My flashlight bounced once, twice, and died. The ache in my legs intensified. Once I regained my breath, I checked the radio, only static. No signal. I tried calling out, but there was nothing. It was in that moment I realized I was utterly alone. The dark down there was unlike anything I had previously experienced. Not shadows, just total blackness. My eyes didn't even attempt to adjust. I may as well have been blindfolded in a box. I didn't scream. I wanted to, but I held back. I trembled until I managed to get my hands moving. My emergency lantern lay in my backpack, but all I had was magnesium flint and some old wrappers. I forced myself to crawl forward, dragging my pack behind while feeling the walls with one hand. After around 10 feet, the tunnel leveled out. I carried on, still in darkness, until I heard it, not me. A scraping sound, slow, near. I froze. The noise halted as well. I reassured myself it must be a rat, or perhaps a beam shifting, but it didn't sound like such. It felt deliberate, as though something listened to my breath. Eventually, I stumbled upon a room, some type of storage alcove. I felt shelves, tools, and a pipe. Using the flint, I ignited a scrap of foil, which was enough to light the emergency lantern's pilot flame. When it flickered on, I saw the walls were covered in handprints, hundreds of them, perhaps more. Tiny ones like those from children. Some were red, others brown, a few nearly black, and some had nails embedded in the impressions, as if they were attempting to claw their way out. Afterward, I vomited, sitting with my back against the cold stone. I stared into nothingness. My legs swelled badly. Each breath was painful. I couldn't stay. I tore a strip from my shirt, tied it around my leg, and began to explore. I used string to retrace my steps, a trick old cave divers used. If my lantern failed, I needed a means to navigate back. The tunnels twisted confusingly. I ended up passing the same broken mining cart 3 times, swearing I hadn't turned. The place felt like it looped in on itself. Next, I found bones, carefully arranged, not buried. Small femurs, rib cages, skulls laid out like toys. Someone or something had devoted time to that arrangement. Nearby, a stick figure had been scratched into the stone, with long, crooked arms and a round face devoid of eyes or a mouth. Soon after, I began to hear voices. Not whispers, but real voices. My mother calling me Mitchie, which only she ever did. Kyle shouting, "We're up here!" A baby's cries echoed. But they were wrong. Their timing was off, like they mimicked human speech but lacked rhythm. Too slow, too steady. It unnerved me. I tried shouting back just once, but my throat constricted and nothing emerged. I found another tunnel that looked promising and noticed a faint light inching toward it. When I reached it, it turned out to be glowing moss on the rocks. No daylight, but in the dust, a fresh handprint still glistened smaller than mine. That night, I think it was night, I sat in a narrow tunnel with a dim lantern, trying to conserve power. Suddenly, the noise came again, closer, scraping, breathing. I turned off the lantern and sat in pitch darkness. Something passed by, not footsteps, but a slithering sound, like skin gliding over the stone, accompanied by damp, gravel-filled breathing. I remained motionless, not even daring to breathe. Eventually, it disappeared. I pushed forward, finally locating another shaft. The ladder was intact, appearing recently reinforced. I climbed up. Halfway through, I heard it again, that hissing sound. I didn't look back. Near the top, I entered a chamber that wasn't on any map. Clean, empty, just a stone pit in the middle, and a child's shoe beside it, brand worn away. That was when I collapsed. I began to weep ugly, choking sobs. I thought that would be my end. Suddenly I felt real air, cold air, wafting from a crack in the far wall. I forced myself through it, the rocks scraping against my back and sides. I didn't care. I crawled like an animal until I saw lights, headlamps. Voices shouted, "We got him." They hoisted me out with a rope, and I screamed the entire time. My eyes couldn't handle the light. The sun felt unreal. Later, I discovered I had been missing for 16 hours. Kyle reported me when I failed to return for lunch. A rescue team was preparing to descend when they heard banging. Me, weakly kicking the wall with what little strength remained. I learned the shaft sealed after a 1952 collapse when 3 boys went exploring and never returned. No bodies ever recovered. Nobody had entered that place in more than 50 years until me. They closed it for good afterward, using steel plates, pouring concrete, and posting warning signs. But I know it's still there. Sometimes, when I'm in my basement, with the air becoming too still, I feel it lurking behind me, cold and watching. My dog refuses to go down there anymore. This event transpired when I was 28. A few friends and I had organized a weekend escape to a cabin near Larkspur Ridge. It was fairly remote, nothing fancy, merely a brief respite from work and the bustle of city noise. I planned to meet them there on a Friday evening. The strategy was straightforward: arrive before sunset, crack open a few beers, possibly grill something. However, I got delayed at work, not hitting the road until much later than planned. By the time I maneuvered the winding roads near the ridge, it was already engulfed in darkness. No towns were nearby, and there was no cell signal, just a 2-lane road weaving through dense trees. I thought I could soldier through and complete the drive. I was barely half an hour from the cabin, but after sitting for hours, feeling cramped and jittery from caffeine, I opted to pull off at a small gravel patch just before a sharp curve. It wasn't marked, but it provided enough space to park safely without getting sideswiped by someone speeding around the bend. I exited to stretch my legs, which felt stiff, with my back in pain. Lighting a cigarette, I leaned against the hood of my car and realized how eerily quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, but dead silent. There was no wind, no crickets, nothing rustled, only the ticking of my engine as it cooled. Then I heard a crunch, one footstep to my right just within the tree line. I didn't move initially, assuming it was perhaps a deer, but another step followed, heavier, paced, as if someone was treading carefully through the dry needles. I called out a simple hello. No reply. Stepping around my car, I strained to see into the woods, where I encountered only dark shapes, shadows upon shadows. That's when I spotted it, a tall figure remaining utterly still between two trees. Not particularly close, but far too near for comfort. Its shape felt off. Tall, yes, but the arms appeared excessively long. Everything about its proportions was skewed. It remained motionless, and I stared at it, trying to comprehend what I was witnessing. But it didn't react. Gradually, I backed toward the car, moving slowly and steadily to avoid startling it. Once inside, I quietly shut the door and started the engine. As the headlights illuminated the trees, nothing was visible. I pulled back onto the road, striving to convince myself it was merely a strange shadow or an optical illusion. A couple of minutes later, I caught sight of it once more. This time, it was in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching, and my seatbelt locked in place. Yet it did not budge. I narrowly swerved around it, struggling to keep the car under control. When I glanced back, it had vanished. My speed increased as my heart raced, thundering so loudly I felt it echo in my ears. I couldn't articulate what I had seen, not even form a coherent thought. I just understood that I had to keep moving. But through the driver's side window, I caught another glimpse of motion among the trees accompanying my car. It kept up with me, not running, but gliding smoothly, with no bounce or shoulder shifts, moving like it was levitating. I floored the gas pedal, and the car rattled as though it was on the verge of falling apart. But that didn't concern me. I needed to flee. After a minute, it faded from sight, but dense fog rolled in thick. I pressed on the accelerator, knowing the cabin turnoff was imminent. When I finally spotted the break in the trees leading to the gravel driveway, I didn't slow down. I turned sharply, and the car jolted violently over the rocks. I didn't stop until I saw the porch lights and nearly stalled the engine. I leapt out and sprinted to the door. My friends swung it open, and I must have looked like I'd emerged from a battle. I couldn't articulate anything immediately. I just sank down and stared at the floor until I managed to catch my breath. We stayed 2 nights, and I didn't step outside once. When I shared my experience with them the following morning, they laughed initially, thinking I was joking, but their laughter quickly ceased when they realized I was sincere. I never drove that route again, not even during daylight hours. I just can't. Whatever I encountered wasn't human, nor was it an animal. While it didn't seek to harm me at that moment, it certainly intended for me to know it was there. I'm a trail surveyor. Not the most glamorous job, but it suits me well. I get paid to trek through national parks, assess trail conditions, document signs of erosion, map water sources, and occasionally install wildlife cameras for tracking. I typically work solo, and I'm accustomed to spending days in the woods. Honestly, I often prefer it. Last October, I was assigned a 3-day solo sweep through a less-traveled section of the Appalachian Mountains, just north of a small town called Elridge in Tennessee. It isn't exactly a tourist destination. Rugged terrain, spotty signals, and steep switchbacks tend to deter casual hikers, but it holds a reputation. Stunning ridge views, dense forests, and remnants of old homesteads from before the land gained its protected status. I had covered nearby areas previously, but this section was new for me. The rangers provided the usual pre-hike briefing: stay alert for loose rocks on the switchbacks, avoid entering any buildings, and don't trust the ancient wells. However, one ranger included a few peculiar warnings. People reportedly had heard strange noises at night, metal snapping sounds when no one was present. One fellow insisted he had been followed along the tree line for a full mile. I merely smiled, nodded, and chalked it up to too much caffeine and not enough sleep. On the first morning, I set out early, parked at a gravel pull-off just past mile marker 12, threw on my pack, and headed in. It was routine. The trail markers were fading, and some of the footbridges looked like they wouldn't withstand another major storm. The streams were running higher than average, and a few crossings left my boots soaked halfway up my ankles. I frequently stopped to jot down notes and snap photos for the final report. That afternoon, I encountered the ruins of the old Marlin cabin. Just piles of stones and a half-dilapidated porch clinging on for dear life. I had seen it in ranger files before, but it looked almost stage-managed in person. The porch had buckled like a broken spine, and the chimney leaned precariously as if it might collapse during a blink. I made camp about a mile past it, off a small rise where the trail forked around a cluster of dead trees. Dinner consisted of a protein bar and some lukewarm coffee from my thermos. I turned in early. The forest was quiet, perhaps too quiet, but I figured the chill had driven the animals into deeper cover. Around 3 a.m., I jolted awake to a soft, steady thumping, not loud, just rhythmic, akin to something being dropped into soft earth repeatedly. Sitting up in my tent, my heart quickened as I listened. No other sounds accompanied the rhythm, so I opted not to unzip the flap, reasoning it was probably a deer or perhaps a bear searching for scraps. After a minute, the sound stopped, and all fell still. I stared at the tent wall for what felt like ages before eventually lying back down. I reassured myself that it must have been the wind. On the second day, I journeyed deeper into the trail loop, heading towards sections that hadn't been maintained in years. The path was challenging, overgrown, tangled limbs, and areas where the track had vanished beneath moss and roots. I was moving slowly, stopping frequently to cut branches and reflag sections. Late morning, I discovered something unusual. An active fire ring, still smoldering, coals faintly glowing beneath the ash. That set off alarm bells. Fires weren't permitted in that area during dry seasons, and the last rain had fallen over a week ago. Next to it lay a small lean-to fashioned from tree limbs and a moldy tarp. Not on any of my maps. I walked in a slow circle, trying to call in the find over my radio, but received no answer. That far in, it wasn't out of the ordinary, yet it was concerning. I flagged the site with tape, gathered GPS coordinates, logged it, and moved on. A few hours later, I stopped to inspect a fallen log for insect activity and noticed something peculiar. 3 long, smooth scratches etched down one side. Each gouge was deep, too clean to have come from another log scraping it. They were far too wide for a raccoon, too evenly spaced for a cat, lacking claw tips or secondary marks, just long, deliberate cuts. I snapped a photo and documented it as possible bear sign, but I knew that visually, it didn't seem right. That night, I set up camp near a spring, one of those trickling clear over an old stone wall. I filtered some water, cooked a freeze-dried meal, and updated my logs. Around 10, I crawled into my tent. Not necessarily tired, just uneasy. There was this odd noise, not loud, more like a low mechanical hum. I sat up and listened intently. It didn't correspond to anything in nature. Maybe distant machinery, but there weren't any service roads for miles. No power lines to be seen either. A few minutes after midnight, I heard leaves crunching. Definite footsteps. Not random rustling, not an animal. Just steady, slow movement across dry earth. I froze, reaching for my knife and pulling the zipper on the inner tent flap just a couple of inches. At first I couldn't see anything. Then I caught a glimpse, tall, thin, It was moving between the trees as though it didn't need to dodge branches or mind its footing. Absent a flashlight, pack, or anything else, it paused right where my fire had been earlier, standing in the clearing, faintly backlit by moonlight. Its limbs appeared too elongated, arms drooping almost to the knees, its head oddly tilted as though listening for something specific. I remained completely still. I didn't blink or breathe. My heart raced, but I clutched my knife and observed closely. Eventually, it turned and vanished into the trees. Didn't run, just melted into the darkness. I couldn't sleep afterward. I sat up the rest of the night, knife on my lap, flashlight at the ready, barely blinking. At first light, I broke camp in under 5 minutes and retraced my steps, skipping breakfast and coffee, just hastening, keeping my gaze on the woods around me, as if they might close in on me. Approximately an hour into the return hike, I passed another lean-to. This one was even older, sagging on one side. I peeked inside without stepping closer. Something inside had been organized. Bones, not fresh, but cleaned and stacked in a tight spiral, as though someone had invested considerable time. Scratched into the back wall was the word "still," written dozens of times. The lower corners showed fresher marks, with the wood curling at the edges, as if it had been carved into that same night. I didn't log it or record GPS. I simply kept going, no breaks, no water. 3 hours later, I approached the Marlin ruins again, and something had changed. Right at the edge of the broken porch sat a small cloth doll, seemingly handmade and stuffed with old rags. Its face was blank, stitched with black thread, and it tilted slightly toward the trail, toward me. I kept moving, not pausing at all. No photos or notes taken. When I saw my truck, I almost dropped to my knees. I didn't even remove my pack, just tossed it into the bed and sped away. Windows down, eyes fixed in the rearview mirror the whole journey back. At the station, I dropped my report on the desk, noting everything I'd encountered. Trail damage, erosion signs, the lean-tos, the fire ring, omitting the footsteps, the figure, and the doll. One of the rangers, Mark, browsed through my photos. Stopping on one from the second day, he asked, "This is from the east side, right?" I affirmed, saying it was just before I set up camp. He turned the screen toward me. In the corner of the frame, barely distinguishable behind a tree trunk, was a pale shape. It wasn't light glare and it wasn't a leaf. It was a face, round, featureless, observing. That was the final job I accepted in Tennessee. Since then, I've focused on the Rockies, Utah, Oregon, Colorado, locations with distances, nearby people, and open sky. I won't venture back to those woods in Elridge, not alone and probably never again. I'm Nate, a regular guy who enjoys hiking. For years I've explored trails, seeking remote paths where nature feels unspoiled. In the summer of 2022, I decided to venture into a part of the Appalachian Mountains in western North Carolina, just outside the boundaries of Pisgah National Forest. I had heard whispers about an old unofficial trail system the locals referred to as Cinder Path. It wasn't present on any public maps, had no markings, and had sat neglected for years. This mystery was what lured me in. I drove down a winding road through the forest that ended at a dilapidated fire tower, abandoned, rusted through, with missing stairs halfway up. There was a small gravel pull-off, but no signage, only a thick tree line marking where an old trail used to be. After parking, I geared up and set out around noon, eager to uncover what secrets the trail held. The first few miles passed without incident. The path was faintly visible beneath my feet, compressed earth and patterns of wear that don't simply disappear even after years of neglect. I hiked about 6 miles that first day. Everything felt ordinary until approximately an hour before sunset. That's when I stumbled upon a ring of stones, waist high and as wide as a dinner table. It was no fire pit, no ash or burns were visible. The stones were pristine, too clean for nature. No moss or leaves, as if someone had meticulously brushed them that very morning. I paused, intrigued by this odd sight, but eventually continued moving. By 6, I had set up camp in a flat area, 30 feet from a dry creek bed. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No animals, no birds, just the wind rustling through the canopy. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of footsteps. Not animalistic, but steady, bipedal, slow. My heart raced as I sat up in my sleeping bag, unzipping the tent just enough to take a peek outside. Initially, I didn't see anything, but then I caught sight of a figure, A man walking past the tree line about 30 yards away. No flashlight, no equipment, just walking. I held my breath and remained motionless. After 2 minutes, he disappeared into the trees, and I couldn't sleep for the rest of that night. In the morning, I found bare footprints in the dirt near my campsite. They had no shoe treads, merely human prints. Numerous loops and circles that seemed like someone was pacing. A shiver ran down my spine. I debated returning, but ultimately decided to push forward. I hadn't covered enough of the trail, and I wasn't going to abandon my hike. I moved quickly that day, tackling 10 miles. I passed 2 more stone rings, identical in size and cleanliness. By mile 16, I halted at something nailed to a tree. A piece of stretched leather, perhaps from an animal, though it had human teeth embedded in it. 5 teeth set in a curve, complete with gums attached. I snapped a photo and logged the location before hiking until sunset. That evening, I skipped dinner. At 2 a.m., I was awakened by a strange humming. Not words, just a deep, slow, tuneless sound. Initially distant, it progressively grew louder as if the trees were amplifying it. I lay there, paralyzed until dawn arrived. At first light, I broke camp and headed west, away from the last marked waypoint. I had no cell signal, but my GPS was functional. The trail became increasingly difficult to navigate as the forest thickened, with broader trunks and tighter spaces. Branches snagged against my pack every 20 feet. I managed 6 miles before discovering a cabin not marked on my map. It had half sunk into a hill, with a collapsed roof and rotting beams. But I noticed drag marks in the dirt leading to the door, lines indicating something heavy had been dragged inside recently. The door was slightly ajar, but I didn't enter. Instead, I made my way around to a small shed located 20 feet behind the cabin. Looking through a crack in the planks, I glimpsed stacks of bones, mostly small ones, some hung up like wind chimes. Next to one pile were toddler-sized sneakers. I fled from the scene. The next few miles are a blur. I simply followed the downward slope, trusting gravity more than my map. Around noon, I reached a ravine and attempted to radio out, still no luck, so I kept going. By 4 p.m., I encountered an old fence line with low wooden posts and barbed wire. I followed it until it met a creek, and just beyond that, I noticed smoke. Real smoke. A campfire emanating from a man named Doyle. Mid-50s, he lived in a hunting shack. When I stumbled out from the trees, he looked as if he had seen a ghost, remarking that nobody ever ventured out that way anymore. Doyle let me use his landline. I contacted the ranger station and provided them with my coordinates. They instructed me to stay put. That night, as I tried to sleep in Doyle's shack, I found it impossible. I asked him why the trail had been abandoned, and he just stared at the floor for an extended period. He mentioned that people began vanishing in groups of 3, and then search parties started returning ill. The following morning, I was airlifted out. The official report stated that the trail was environmentally unstable, and no further exploration would be scheduled. I inquired about the cabin, the shed, and the bones, but they told me no structures had been documented in that area. I can't explain what lurks out there. I only know that something keeps watch over that old path, something that maintains its cleanliness, hums among the trees, and circles strangers' tents. Since that experience, I've hiked countless trails, camped in the snow, trekked through lightning storms, and faced landslides, but I refuse to return to the Appalachians. That summer, my uncle permitted me to stay at his old cabin located near Spruce Hollow, nestled at the upper edge of the Blue Ridge. He had injured his rotator cuff during trail work, clearing deadfalls or carrying something too heavy, and needed someone to oversee the place while he recuperated. It wasn't particularly strenuous work, just clearing overgrowth, replacing trail signs, and ensuring no squatters had taken residence in the area. I had recently graduated with no job lined up. My plans for the summer consisted mainly of drifting aimlessly and perhaps discovering a bit more about myself. The prospect of several weeks devoid of people, noise, or the constant buzz of my phone every 5 minutes sounded downright perfect. The location of the cabin was remote, extremely remote. The last turn took us down a gravel switchback road that wound upward for what seemed an eternity, with potholes deep enough to throw a car's alignment off merely by looking at them. I had to stop at a small place called Marty's Fuel and Bait to refill and double-check my spare tire. Once you passed the dilapidated mile marker and lost signal, that was it. Just me and the forest. At first I adored it. I woke up to utter silence. No engines, no voices, just tranquility. I'd hike along the ridgeline, looking for dislodged signs, swapping any broken trail markers. Many days I wouldn't encounter another soul. My meals consisted of cooking over a propane stove, browsing through dog-eared paperbacks discovered in the storage bins, and drawing up daily to-do lists. Porch boards bounced when stepped on wrongly, a water pump squeaked before engaging, and the screen door never fully latched unless you were adept at yanking it just right. These small repairs kept me in sync, occupied my hands and quieted my head. The first time something felt amiss was a Wednesday. I remember clearly because I had just trekked out to the northern junction to replace a trail sign at a peculiar fork near a dried-up creek bed. The old post had snapped cleanly in two across the grain. It bore no signs of being rotten or weathered, merely broken like something heavy or an irate individual had done it. At the time, I attributed it to a fallen branch or an overzealous hiker armed with a hatchet. I brushed it off, not yet concerned. Returning later in the day, my boots muddy and shoulders aching, I kicked them off at the door, plopped down into the recliner with a book, and was caught halfway between reading and dozing off when I heard it. A single creak. Not loud, not impactful, just enough to shatter the stillness. It emanated from the kitchen floorboards. Initially, I assumed maybe a mouse had squeezed through the cracks, or it was simply the cabin settling. Old wood has a way of doing that. Still, something urged me to sit up. I stared toward the kitchen. Nothing moved. Moonlight fell through the window, stretching long across the counter and casting a muted yellow hue that highlighted everything. It appeared unchanged, yet I felt the air thickening, as though the room was no longer empty, despite its appearance. I stood up and scanned the entire cabin. It didn't take long. It consisted of the main room with a recliner and kitchen, alongside a short hallway leading to two doors, one for my bedroom, the other the gear room with the bathroom tucked toward the back. Every window was locked, both doors secured. Everything seemed normal, but tranquility evaded me. I flicked on the shortwave radio, letting static fill the space. I liked the noise. It helped ease the oppressive silence. Generally, I would pick up snippets of weather updates or conversations from the fire tower, but that night, it offered only static, incoherent murmurs surfacing intermittently. Nothing comprehensible. I didn't feel like eating, yet I forced down a can of chili, searching for something to occupy my time. I cleaned the pan and returned it, even rearranging items in the cabinet that I inherently didn't need to touch, grasping for anything to feel routine. Once night fell, I became jittery, unable to settle. Frayed nerves left me restless. Every creak in the rafters resembled something waiting. Eventually, I crawled into bed, staring at the ceiling until sleep finally swept over me. When I awakened, it was exactly 2:47 a.m., not due to a dream, nor because I needed to use the restroom, but because I had heard yet another creak, this time in the hallway. Initially, I didn't move, simply lay still, controlling my breath while attempting to hear past my heartbeat. It wasn't loud, but a subtle shift in weight, like someone ever so slightly adjusting their foot. Slowly, I slipped out of bed and eased toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Nothing. Opening it, I saw the same hallway, only this time, the window above the kitchen sink stood wide open, and I mean wide open, fully pushed out as if someone had cranked it until it clicked and left it that way. I hadn't touched that window once. It wasn't the kind that opened on its own. You had to force it, listening for the groan it would make. Moving cautiously into the kitchen, I peered outside. Only black trees and a dim sliver of moonlight awaited me. No movement, no sound. Yet I knew that window hadn't been open. I shut it, secured it, then stood still, breath soft, shallow, coming from the gear room. I acted on instinct. I neither shouted nor tried to scare it off. I turned slowly and walked toward the front door. The deadbolt was stuck. Not jammed or locked incorrectly, just stuck. I jiggled the knob, twisting the bolt vigorously. It groaned but refused to budge. Behind me, just behind, I heard a sound. Not a footstep, not a voice. Merely a bare shuffle, as if weight was shifting between feet. With my shoulder, I crashed into the door. The bolt yielded. Swinging it open, I bolted barefoot down the gravel path, unconcerned about cutting my feet. I didn't halt until reaching the ranger station at the end of the trail system. The rangers were startled to see me at 4 a.m., wild-eyed and without shoes. They draped me in a blanket, asked a few questions, then sent a few guys up to investigate the place. They returned an hour later, not saying much, only that no one was there. except that the gear room door had been propped open with a piece of bark wedged beneath the hinge. Inside, they discovered muddy footprints. Bare feet, not mine, larger. The footprints split into two directions, one leading toward the recliner and another to the kitchen window. They halted behind the chair, leaving no footprints emerging from that area. Just a set of feet that had entered without exiting. My uncle sold the cabin that fall, mentioning in passing that he was too old for that kind of lifestyle. I never told him the reason behind my departure. I was 23 when I joined a trail survey crew, thinking a few weeks off the grid in the Appalachians would serve as a reset. You know how people romanticize returning to nature as a peaceful, cleansing experience? That was my goal. Fresh out of a difficult breakup, burnt out from my job staring at spreadsheets for 12 hours daily, and living in a studio apartment where the walls felt constrictive. I needed a transformation, something genuine. So when the chance arose to work with a forest trail crew in the Blue Ridge Mountains, it seemed ideal. Long hikes, quiet nights, devoid of Wi-Fi, distractions, just me, a few unfamiliar guys, and miles of untouched forest. Little did any of us realize, at least not initially, that we were venturing into a place that didn't desire our presence. Our task was clear-cut. We were to assess trail erosion and clear debris along a long-forgotten segment of the Pisgah Loop. It hadn't been maintained for years, not officially closed but not openly accessible either. You had to have knowledge or connections to even locate it on a map. My first indication something was amiss came when I stopped at a gas station about 20 miles from the trailhead. The attendant appeared as if he had been working there since the Nixon era. His skin weathered and his eyes blinked infrequently. When I disclosed our destination, he stared at me longer than appropriate and muttered, "Some trails ought to remain lost." I chuckled, assuming it was just one of those local warnings akin to, "Don't mess with the bears," or "Don't park near the ravine." We dismissed his advice. The crew was made up of 5 of us, me, Jake, Dom, Curtis, and Travis. Jake and Dom exemplified the outdoorsman vibe, always muddy boots, pocket knives at the ready, exuding the scent of campfire smoke even in its absence. Curtis was slightly older, maybe in his late 30s, serving as the unofficial leader, possessing a calm demeanor that induced a feeling of control even amid chaos. Then there was Travis, the quiet type who rarely spoke, yet knew these woods like the back of his hand. He hailed from a nearby town without even a post office. We hiked in, loaded down with gear, tents, tools, and canned food. It took most of the day to reach a point where even the birds appeared different. We settled near an overgrown creek bed surrounded by towering oaks and moss-covered boulders, eerily beautiful in an unspoiled way. The first 2 days passed smoothly. We cleared paths, gathered erosion measurements, and mapped where the trail had virtually vanished. Nights were chilly, but nothing intolerable. We sat around the campfire, dined on beans and jerky, and shared sips from a flask Jake had smuggled. Jokes flew and groans erupted, feeling good and normal. That all changed on the 3rd night. Late, it was incredibly quiet. I was half asleep when Jake unzipped his tent and whispered, "Did you guys hear that?" I sat up bleary-eyed. "Hear what?" "Footsteps," he said. "Bare feet walking around us. Slow." Dom laughed. "Probably a raccoon. Go back to sleep." But the following morning, we found a single footprint in the mud. Absolutely one of its kind. No heel, just toes, wide and splayed like a child's, yet stretched weirdly, just not quite right. No other prints surrounded it. Nothing else had moved, just that lone footfall. From then on, the forest shifted. The air thickened as if the atmosphere pressed down upon us. Not cold, just oppressive. The trees ceased their rustling. Even the bugs fell silent. Our compasses misbehaved, needles spinning like we had entered the Bermuda Triangle, while GPS readings failed, directing us back to coordinates we had recorded hours earlier. That's when Dom claimed to have seen someone while hiking to the next clearing. He abruptly halted and pointed across the gorge. "There," he said, "by that crooked pine." "Didn't you see her?" None of us did. He described her, barefoot, long hair glistening like seaweed. He paused, confessing, "She was watching us." We exchanged worried glances, attempted to laugh off the atmosphere, but something had indeed shifted. The woods no longer felt empty. They felt conscious, as though we were being watched, judged, perhaps even toyed with. Then Travis disappeared. We discovered an old ranger cabin on the map, near the base of a gorge. and Travis offered to check it out while we cleared a fallen tree obstructing the trail. He was meant to return quickly, 15, 20 minutes at most, but he didn't come back. We attempted to reach him over the radio. Static greeted us, followed by silence. After an hour, we ventured down the path to find his backpack neatly placed on a rock, still zipped and untouched, as though he had merely stepped away. There were no tracks leading away, nothing disturbed except yet another bare footprint in the mud, identical to the prior one. That's when Curtis stated firmly, "We need to leave now." We all agreed, but the radio was utterly dead. Batteries full, lights functioning, yet transmitting nothing. Jake decided to scout higher ground for a signal up the ridge. He set out just before sunset and never returned. That night, the three of us wandering the woods couldn't sleep. Two on edge, twisting with anxiety. The forest lay silently. Utterly devoid of sound. No wind, no animals, just the crackling of a dying fire. Then Dom snapped, announcing his intent to pack up, swearing he knew a shortcut and was done waiting. We pleaded with him, but he vanished into the darkness before we could finish our argument. Then there were just Curtis and me. Around 2 a.m., I heard a sound, a dragging noise, slow and wet, as if something were being pulled across the ground. Then a soft brushing against my tent, no shuddering, merely contact, as if exploring. I remained still and silent, staring at the tent's ceiling while fighting tears. When I finally dared to unzip it at dawn, Curtis was gone. His tent was zipped from the inside, his sleeping bag saturated with something thick and black, like tar or old blood. The odor was sharp and sweet, reminiscent of rotting fruit left in the sun. Paralyzed with uncertainty, each direction appeared wrong. The trail markers had vanished. The trees leaned rashly, casting shadows in unnatural angles. The sunlight seemed artificial, akin to the flickering bulb of a gas station bathroom. I wandered for days, scavenging for moss, tree bark, whatever didn't smell of death. I ceased to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear that dragging step or feel breath behind my ear. Eventually, I stumbled upon the cabin, or what remained of it. It had crumbled in upon itself, overtaken by vines. But inside, the others were there. Their bodies were arranged, twisted, contorted into positions that defied nature. Arms nailed to wood, heads turned entirely as if gazing backward. Carved into every wall and surface were symbols, spirals, eyes, and rows of jagged teeth. Countless times I ran, but I don't recall how far. My feet bled, my throat raw. Somehow, I managed to break free, stumbling upon a fire road just as two hikers rounded a bend. They froze upon seeing me, remarking I resembled a corpse that had clawed its way out. I never encountered them again, or anyone from our crew. Rangers searched, found my gear, the cabin, but no bodies or blood. They concluded it was trauma, hallucinations from stress, or perhaps contaminated water with mushrooms. But I know what I witnessed. Occasional nights, late and too quiet, I still hear it. The dragging step in the hallway outside my bedroom and the whisper of breath against the window. And when I dream, oh God, when I dream, they're all still there. Jake, Travis, Curtis, Dom, watching from just beyond the tree line, eyes wide and mouths agape. Some places were never meant to be discovered, and some trails were never intended to be walked.